In this video, we're going to take a look at a new Max for Live plugin from Pointblank, the Pointblank Vocoder. This is exclusively available from pointblankmusicschool.com, so follow the link in the description to access the download, and if you're interested, check out the range of courses that Pointblank offer. If you're not sure how to install a Max for Live plugin, then watch one of the previous videos, such as the Kick Drum Designer, where I run through how to do this. Or you can just drag and drop the AMXD file directly onto a track within Ableton. Vocoders were originally developed by Homer Dudley at the Bell Labs back in the 1930s when he was experimenting with speech synthesis, but they're also used to efficiently transmit speech for the telecommunications industry and in addition found use within the military. The typical sound you're probably familiar with is a voice modulating a synth sound, so it sounds like a synth is talking.
This is the sound of a vocoder.
You could also check out Kraftwerk's We Are the Robots as just one example. It's important to realise that a vocoder needs two signals to work. A modulator signal, which is typically a dynamic sound such as a voice or drum beat, and a carrier signal, which is often a sustained sound such as a pad or synth sound. A vocoder works by splitting both of these signals through a number of bandpass filters, which is defined by the number of bands, and outputs the common frequency between the two signals, so it basically creates a composite sound of the modulator and carrier. In this schematic, you can see the individual bands of the modulator control the volume of the corresponding bands of the carrier signal. So if this was a 16-band vocoder, then we would see 16 filters rather than 4 distributed across the frequency spectrum. When we insert the vocoder plugin onto a track within Ableton, the sound on that track is the modulator signal, and by default, pink noise is initially the carrier source. Let's press play. So what we can hear is a breakbeat, if I just adjust the wet dry, modulating or vocoding pink noise. So let's look at some of the parameters here that we can adjust. So the main parameter here is specifying the number of bands. So if I bring this down to 4, you can hear the sound changes. It's slightly dirtier now. And we can adjust the level of these individual band filters just by clicking and dragging here. If I increase the number of bands, it changes in sound. And this multi-slider works, I suppose, a bit like a graphic EQ. Okay, if I do this, it filters out the low frequencies. Or if I come from the top, we can filter out the high frequencies. This is completely automatable, and we'll show that later on. We can also determine the frequencies of the different filters by adjusting the range down here. So this lower one here affects the carrier. So if I pull down the high value, we're going to get a darker sound. Or if I bring up the low one, you can also adjust within this graphic range slider just by holding down Shift key and then clicking with the mouse. It's up to you. The top one controls the actual filters for the modulator. Okay, so if I bring this down, we should get a simpler pattern. And it's really interesting. You can bring out different elements. And this can be quite useful sometimes, actually, to layer with the sound. So again, if I just adjust the wet dry, we're kind of enhancing certain elements within the actual sound. If you want to reset the range controls, then you can just double click in between and it resets to the low and high values. Also, what can be quite interesting is adjusting the slide parameter. And this will basically slide whenever you change the frequency of your bandpass filters. Okay, it's probably best demonstrated if I press play. Let me put it back to wet and increase the bandwidth. This will create these kind of interesting tube-like textures. Okay, now if I adjust the high value, okay, you can hear those sliding downwards. And it's all to do with the duration of the slide. This will also impact on when you're adjusting the number of bands. If I just draw in a little shape like that. And then we get some quite interesting textures to come out of this. You've also got the ability to change the kind of dirtiness of the noise. Gives us a little bit of extra crunch in the sound. And then we've also got envelope settings here as well. Or we can go nice and short and choppy. When you're working with lots of bands, if I increase this to 64, you'll notice as you're dragging around that it leaves out certain faders. Okay, so I'd advise you just to leave it as standard if you're going to be automating. But you've also got a smoothing mode as well. Okay, so now you can just draw shapes and it automatically interpolates any slider there to create a nice smooth shape. Okay, so that's just switching the edit mode. As well as the pink noise, we can also route through any other track within Ableton. And to achieve this, you click on the noise button and it comes up with this menu. So I'm going to choose Celestial Pad, which is a track here where I've got, let me just turn that on. I've just got a pad sound. I'm going to switch it to sends only. Okay. And so I don't hear it. And that's selected now. So now if I press play, let me just reduce the bands because it's going to be easier for me to work with. So that's a little bit loud. Depending on your sources is whether you'll need to adjust this depth parameter. I'm just going to reset my filters here. It's a bit better. So you can obviously sculpt the overall sound. Okay, also play with that bandwidth setting as well. Good. So the vocoded sound is going to be a combination of your modulation source and your carrier source, and you get a huge amount of variation depending on what sounds you choose. There's nothing to stop you modulating two beats together, okay, or using vocals or whatever. Just experiment around and hear what sounds this vocoder is capable of. If you want to automate the vocoder, then you've got a whole range of parameters available to you. The only one which is slightly quirky is how you control the bands. Okay, so it's not the individual faders, it's the actual XY controller is what you're automating. Okay, so if I just come back here, click on record, and depending on what you're doing, it may be sensible to reset just across the top before you start automating. Depends what mode you're in, really. But there you go. You can now see it's storing in the actual two parameters there. Let's go here and I'll choose X for here. Okay, so that controller is basically XY. And that can also be impacted as well if you change the number of bands. It now won't go all the way across. Okay, and equally, if you reduce the number of bands, it will look as though your XY only goes to this position here. If you want to use a vocal or a voice as a modulation source, you might need to adjust the parameters a touch. So I've got here a nice fat, raspy analog sound. I'm going to switch that back to sends only, and then come back to the vocoder track. So it's lacking a bit of clarity. So probably the first thing I'll do is just increase the high range here. So we use some of those kind of higher frequencies. And also if we tighten the bandwidth as well, that will just help give a little bit more definition. We can also add more definition by clicking on the precise mode here. Now this will change the nature of the sound slightly, but if you're after clarity, then it's probably what you want to do. Okay. And then I'd also probably tweak the attack and decay settings. You might need to increase the depth. Okay, and equally you might want to just experiment with different settings here with the low value as well. But actually, that's working pretty well. The other parameter you might want to explore is the number of bands. So the more bands, potentially the clearer the sound. Okay, but that's a kind of good starting point if you're going to be using vocals. And the other consideration when working with a vocoder is making sure that your modulator signal has similar frequencies to the carrier signal as well. So that's the main features of the point-blank vocoder. I recommend you only use one instance of it in a project and ideally resample the sound as soon as you're happy with it. If you want more information on our courses online or at our different schools around the world, then head over to pointblankmusicschool.com.